Hello class, welcome to the React course. My name is Mass. Just to give you a bit of information about me, I've been working as a web developer for about 20 years. I most of that time as a freelancer. I'm still a freelancer today. I use React. I'm mainly a front-end developer now, and I use React for my daily job along with other libraries. And I've been using that for about 4 years now. I also used several other similar libraries in the past, but is now mainly focused on using React. Um, I just opened the official website, which is called reactjs.org. React is created by Facebook, and Facebook uses this for Facebook, obviously, and then for Instagram, and maybe other things. I don't know. Just to look at the subtitle here to get started, it says a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. So that's basically what React is. And yeah, we're going to talk about that later. React is built on components. That's the way you write a website in React. It says it's component based here. It says it's declarative, which means that it will update efficiently. I'm not going to read through it. You can read it yourself. It will very efficiently update the website. It's fairly easy to make high performance websites. The component based means that you can build encapsulated components that will not affect other parts of the website. These things might be a little abstract to you, but if you had tried to build a website in the older generation of libraries, this would be a lifesaver because that was quite difficult. And with React, these things become much, much easier. So, and the third thing is this, they write learn once, write anywhere, which basically means that you can use it for other things as well. One of the main things is React Native, which means that you can write mobile applications. We're not going to cover mobile applications or React Native, just to know that it's there. And once you learn React, starting to use that is fairly easy. There's not a big difference between the two. So the main thing to understand about React is this component based. So what does that actually mean? If we look at the lesson plan for this week, there is this article, Thinking the React Way, which is also part of the official documentation. I have it open here. So we can just look at this. I have already scrolled it down. It looks like this. You can see they have this screenshot here. So what it basically means is in React, everything is a component, especially for the view layer. So when you build complex applications, instead of building everything at the same time in one big mess, you split it up into logical parts. So you can see they have this little example here. We're going to go over another example in a minute, where they have this little search field. They have a search field and they have some name and some sporting goods, and it's probably something for a web shop or something similar. You can see the way they assume that you would split this in React is they have these lines. I'm not sure you can see it, but the yellow line around this here is the one they call filterable product table. We're going to try this once we start up the code. I'm just going to give you a brief overview and we're going to look at some of the stuff in the code. So they have one component, which is the full component. It's all of it. But inside it, they also split it into multiple parts. So we can see the search field up here has a blue line around it. They call this search bar. So that's another component. Then they have a green component here, which is the results. They call it product table. Oops, sorry. And then they have this turquoise, which is the headlines. They call it product category row, another component. And the red ones, which they call product row, is another component. So even though this looks like one bit, this is built up of 5 different components. So that's the gist of using React. When you want to build a website in React, you split it out into components, into its logical parts. So you can build each one separately, you can reuse them, and it just makes everything easier. And we'll see this once we start looking at the code. I'm just gonna go over this first. To take another example, if we wanted to do this with a real website, let's just take Google as an example. If we wanted to split this into its logical parts, one could say that one would be the header, which is this part up here, mainly this part over here. Another would probably be this thing that opens when you click this. That's the thing that opens with all these applications you can use. That would be a component. The logo itself would probably be a logo component, so it could be reused in other places where you have a logo. The search bar would be a search bar component. and the buttons would be two components. Well, it'll probably be the same component. It'd be one button component, but it will be used two times. And then you have this, you could use another component for this part here and probably another one for the footer down here. So that's basically what React is about. Splitting a website, making it into its logical parts, and then building these separately. This is a little abstract at the moment because we haven't looked at code, but we're going to do that now. So Facebook luckily created a library which will help people get started with React, and it's quite good. I already found it. I'm just how to find it. If you type in your search bar, create React app in Google, the first result will be this page here, which is the official page, and it will have some description of how to use this. I'm not gonna go through all this stuff. What we really want to find is this command down here, npx create React app, and then it says my app. And my app is a name you choose, whatever your application should be called. And npx is a helper library that is installed along with npm. So I assume you all used npm as part of your Node course, so you should already have this installed. So if you type this into your console, and I already did it because it takes a couple of minutes for it to complete and I don't want to wait in the video. So if you type React app, create npx, create React app, and give it a name. I called mine counter. Click return. I'm not going to do it now. Let's just see, I did it before. I click return like this, and it will install this. And this takes a couple of minutes. And it will install into whatever folder you're in, and it will then install React to get started. So it will look something like this when you're done. So I already did it because, like I said, it takes a while. And I have it here. So let's just start off by looking at what is inside this library, what it installed for us. So we have a Git folder, which is GitHub. It's not something you need to touch. Then we have the Node modules folder. You can see all the dependencies that it installed. It's a big application. Luckily, Facebook maintains all this for us. Don't need to worry too much about that. We have a public folder. The public folder is icons, fonts, images, static files that are not JavaScript code, but stuff that you want to, when you release your app at some point, when you make it live, these images and all this stuff needs to be available to someone. So if you put it in the public folder, it would be available to people when they visit your website. We're not going to dwell too much on that right now because it's not that important at the moment. The important thing we have, will package JSON. I assume you saw that one before. The name of the app that I gave it, it fills this in automatically, some versioning, these things. And you can see the dependencies it installs, React, React DOM, and React scripts. React scripts is create React app. And then it has these scripts here, these commands you can use, start, build, test, and eject. The one we're interested in currently is start, because start will start this basic application. Let's just see what that looks like. So I'm just gonna go into my folder, gonna run npm start. So when you run npm start, it's gonna start this application and it's probably gonna open it for you as well. Let's see what happens. There we go. And see, it says starting the development server. It will show you some IP address and it will start this localhost 3000. And once it gets up and running, it will show the basic application that you get here. There we go. See, it says this, and you can see it locally here, and you have a network address. This doesn't really matter that much. The interesting one is localhost 3000, which it opens. And you can see it has a logo that spins, edit source app, and save to reload, and then there's a link to the official website. So let's have a look at what it created here. So inside the source folder, we have some files that it made for us. We have these service worker setup tests. We don't have to worry about these for a while. These are rarely used, at least for at this level. We have app test JSON, JS, and app.js, and we have a CSS file. So let's open this one. So you can see here, this looks very similar to HTML, and it's not HTML. Let's just hang on. I'm just going to pause this for a minute. All right. So let's have a look at what's inside this file. You can see At first it says import React from React. I'm not sure you've seen this import statement before. You probably used Node, which doesn't use this, but it basically imports React from the dependency, and this is needed for every file that has React code inside it. Then it imports a logo from logo SVG. This is an image, so but when it loads this, it will load, I can show you that. It will load the path to the image. So it's basically this image that is spinning that it loads into the app. It loads app.css, which is the styling. And we can see, oh, I'm gonna close that one. Just close this. Start. And you can see inside the styling, this is a common style sheet. This is similar to when you had the CSS class. And you can see if I change anything, that's a good thing about React. I'm going to just make this white. It's going to save it and it's going to refresh instantly. So whenever you change anything inside React, we're using this create React app library. It's going to update instantly. So it makes it easier for you to code. But you can see here, this is a normal style sheet. And I just import it into the file and it will work magically. It's not magic, but it's inside this create React app. All this is taken care of for you. Then we have a function called app, which returns a block of HTML, apparently. And you can see this is not quite HTML though. It looks like HTML, but it's called JSX, and we're going to cover that in a minute. There's a few minor differences, but they're very few. And for the most part, you can consider this similar to HTML. You can see one thing that is different. This here, this class name, which in normal HTML would just be called class. This is the CSS class, my class. But class in JavaScript code is a reserved name, so it doesn't work. Let's just open the console here. You can see here, it will give a warning, invalid DOM property class, did you mean class name? So inside JSX or inside a React component, we always use class name for classes. And the reason for that is, like it says, it doesn't say that. The reason for that is in JavaScript, a class is my class, which you learned earlier, something like that. So class in JavaScript code means a class. It doesn't mean a CSS class. Let's just pause it. All right, let's cover JSX. We're going to go back to that. I'm just going to show you what these things are and how they're used. So one of the things we can do with React, like I said, things are made into components. So a component in React is similar. This is one component. This is just called app, and this is one component. We could make a separate component. I will gonna make this. Let's just do it as a function as well. My name. So I'm gonna make a component. Okay. Actually, before we start this, let's just talk a little bit more about this. So we have the function here. This is a core component. This is the app. So this is the full application, which is one component. You can see that it's a function. It returns this HTML. Inside the HTML is the logo, which we import as a variable. And it's used these brackets to inject a variable, to use a variable inside the HTML code or the JSX code. And we're going to see how this works. So let's just remove this. We're not going to need this for now. Let's remove this. So now we just have the styling and we have the app. So when I save that, it's just going to be a blank page, right? Because there's no content. If I wrote some content here, it will show that on the page. There we go. So let's say I want to build some more components, because this is one component. So let's say I want to put my name in here. So let's try to make a component again. I'm going to use an arrow function instead. So we're going to say my name, and we're going to do an arrow function. Sorry. There we go. We're going to return, similar to the other one. and we're going to return some HTML. So I'm going to just make a span, and I'm going to say my name is Mass. So obviously when I save this, well, not obviously, but when I save this, still nothing happens because I haven't used it. I just created a component. I created an arrow function. So if I want to use this, I can put it into my another component, a React component, and I just write it just like I write HTML, but I will write my name, the same name that I gave the function, and I will just make a close bracket. And it's similar to doing this. A close bracket is the same as having a starting and a closing bracket. If you just want to close it, which you typically do in React, at least often, you would just write it like this. So you can say it says my name is Mass. And the thing about having reusable components is that if I put it again, it will say my name is Mass twice. So I'll be able to reuse whatever this block is. Obviously, this is very simple. This could be a complicated application. So I can just write it once in this component and I can just use it as many times as I want. Let's just make a break here. Just make a div instead so it doesn't all come into one line. There we go. So you'll see now it splits into two. And I can keep going, of course. If I wanted to have 10 of these, I could, and it's just going to keep posting the same thing. Because I write it once inside my component, return some HTML, and I can reuse it as many times as I want. Obviously, well, not obviously, but we probably want to have, right now it says my name is Mass. I'm probably not the only person who has a name, so it would be nice to be able to give different data. So components can also do that. You can pass in a name, you can pass in a variable to a component using the same structure as you use for HTML, which is attributes. But in React, you can call them whatever you want. So I'm just going to call this name. So if I do like this, name, Mass, and I'm going to do name here, name, John. I'm going to do name here, name, Susan. So right now, it's still going to be the same. I did this change, but these all look the same because I hard coded my name into this one. So how do I get that out? For everything you pass in through attributes is called properties. So same name as you use for HTML, whatever you pass in here is called properties. And all React components will have this props as an argument. So inside props, you can just console log it out and you'll see it. You can see it renders 3 times for each component, and the first one has name Mass, second one name John, and the third one name Susan. And these are all objects. So whatever you pass into this, I could add more if I wanted to, test, whatever, and it will see that it will also add that. So you can pass properties or props into components using these attributes, similar to HTML. We're going to go over this in a bit more detail in a little bit. I just want to give you a quick overview before we get started. So the thing is, now I have this in my props, I want to have it here. So in order to give variables inside the HTML or the JSX code, we're going to use the curly brackets. So I can say props name. Let's try it again. Save. And you will see now they change. So now we have a dynamic component that returns HTML that can take arguments, props, and it can be reused. So however many times I wanted to do this, if I have 100 people, I just need to pass in the name, but all the HTML block can be reused to every time. So that's one of the core benefits. This is a very, very simple example, obviously. And normally you would have maybe 50, maybe hundreds of components to build a website. But each of them can be isolated into these small chunks of reusable code, which is the benefit of React, one benefit at least. Okay, so that's one component. And we're going to talk about it. This is called a functional component because it uses a function and it looks like this. The other way you can write components in React is class-based components. So if you remember your class from the JavaScript course, so I'm going to say my second name. I'm just going to write this out so you can see what it looks like. Extends React component. And instead of returning directly, because this is a class, it needs to have um, methods similar to when you use classes earlier. So instead of just writing return, which is not going to work because it doesn't is not valid in JavaScript, you will have a function, or sorry, a member of this class called render. And inside render, you can return. Let's just try that. I'm just going to copy this. So my second name is props name. This is, well, this is not going to work, but I'm just going to show you anyway, just why it doesn't work. So I'll say mass, and our second name is Jensen. Let's try to save that, and we'll give an error. Props is not defined. And why it gives this error is because this is a class-based component. So props, you can see in the functional component, props are passed in as an argument. In a class-based component, this you cannot pass anything into it. Well, you can, but not like this. So in a functional component, this is called this. Remember this, also from the JavaScript class, this props. Let's just try to save it. Oh, it fails completely. I'll just put this here. So instead of using props directly, which you can do in functional components, in class-based components, you need to use the this to access the props. And you can see now it worked. My second name is Jensen. And I can keep doing this. These components are exactly the same. They do the same thing. Class-based components uses classes. We're going to cover lifecycle methods later. It has a different way of handling that. Classes were the main thing everyone used up to about a year and a half ago. And then some new features came out, and now most people, or at least the modern way of writing React, is using functional components. So I would recommend you use this approach instead of this, but both are fine. And you will probably experience both. Once you get a job somewhere, you will probably see both of these styles. Okay, so that's a little bit of introduction to components, and components always need to return HTML like this. Either return it here or you have the render method, which returns it. If you don't have a render method, it will fail. Let's try it. You see, your render method should always have return statement. So if you don't return HTML from your component, it's not going to work. Okay, so let's just try, instead of one last thing we're going to try for this. Instead of writing it like this, where I have my hard-coded values, Mass, John, Susan, it would be nice to have an array of this. So we can just maintain it in an array. Either we get it from an API, we might get it from somewhere else. But let's just do an array. Let's do Mass, John, and Susan. So instead of hard coding all this stuff, we can actually use data we get from an API or from wherever we get it from. So again, inside this, every time you are inside your JSX code or your HTML code, but it's JSX, it looks the same. If you want to use JavaScript, you can use the curly brackets. So just like in normal JavaScript, you can use, if you want to iterate over this array here, I can use map. I can just say name, and then I can, like normally, let's just do it like this, like an implicit return. I'm just going to do an explicit return, make it easier to read. So just like normally in normal JavaScript, where you have these map function or the for each or filter, whatever you do, typically you use map inside JSX. You can loop it instead, and then I can just return my name. And I will do this, make a bracket, and I will use the variable I have here, name, and I will close it. And I can remove this. So you'll see this should look exactly the same. And it does. We're just going to cover this here in a bit. So instead of having these hard-coded, you can use normal attributes, arrays, objects, whatever, and render them. Especially arrays, you can loop them with map, return the name, return whatever you need, components, and it makes life, well, it's necessary, obviously, to not have to hard-code everything. So this is how you render stuff with a map inside, and this is used very often. You can just see this error here. Each child in a list should have a unique key prop. That's React causing this. It's not an error, it's a warning. So it will still work. And the reason is when you map it like this, when you have a component like this, React can figure out what this component is and it can uniquely identify it. It will give it an ID internally inside React so it knows where it is and what component it is. When you use a map, it cannot do that because they are all created at the same time. So it can't tell them apart. Well, not created at the same time, but it can't tell them apart. So it will give you this warning. Each child in a list should have a unique key prop. So when you use an array, you have to give it a key and it has to be unique. Luckily, we know in this one that the name is unique, so we can just put the name in here. And this key here is only used internally in React, and it uses it if it wants to re-render the page, so it knows which components are which and which ones needs to be updated. That's what it uses it for. So if I save this with key, this arrow should go away. There should be no difference up here, and you can see it. You'll most likely experience this a bunch of time with this key. It's a very common thing. Okay, so this is a very basic component, one functional component. There's three components actually. One functional with an arrow function, one using a class-based component, which extends React component. You have to do this. If you want to have a class component, you always have to extend React component, which has the render method that returns HTML and uses a prop. And then we have, well, a names array that we use for mapping, and we have the application component. And obviously I can change whatever I want. I can add more components in here and they will show up on the page. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about JSX. So the reason JSX exists is that normally in JavaScript, it would not be allowed to put HTML inside JavaScript code. It would fail. It would give a warning, it would give an error that this is not valid syntax because obviously HTML is a markup language, JavaScript is a programming language, and you can't just mix the two however you want. So Facebook invented this. I'm not even sure if Facebook invented it actually, but Facebook uses this JSX for React. So you're able to return HTML code inside your React code, and you're able to use these curly parentheses or brackets to inject variables into the HTML code, just like this. It makes it much easier, as you can probably, most of you probably remember how you used create element to create DOM elements and append child and all that stuff. All that stuff is not used anymore. This is much easier, much faster, much more readable, and more maintainable. So this is a good thing. So, but just keep in mind that this is not HTML code. This is JSX code, but it works almost the same as HTML code. Let's just see what it actually looks like. There is a, let me just see it, Babel.io. Internally, React uses something called Babel. I'm not sure you are already familiar with that. I have this one here. Babel is a compiler. So once you build this, you can write this code in JSX with React, with modern syntax. And once you put it on the page, what is actually on the page is compiled code. So it will rewrite this code, all this JSX, it will convert it into normal JavaScript code that the browser can understand. So let's just take this here. We have this, well, does not look like how I expected. Let's just open that. There we go. I already tried this out. All right. So let's just try to paste this in so you can see what JSX looks like when Babel transpiles it. You will never need to do this by hand, by the way. This is handled by the library just to give some information. So if I paste this in, this is what my JSX code looks like. And you can see Babel will then create this JavaScript code for it instead. And it looks like this. And it will create all your application code, which can be hundreds of thousands of lines of code. It will create these files for you, so it just works magically. So you don't have to write all this stuff by hand. You could write it like this if you wanted to. I would not recommend it. But the library will take care of it for you, or Babel will take care of it for you. So this is what creates the DOM structure. This is what creates the page, all this stuff here that the user will actually see. Okay. We don't have to dwell on this too much. You will likely never need to do this manually. It's just to give you an understanding of how it works. Okay, let's just have a look at one more file we didn't cover, which is the index file. So this is a component, three components actually. Normally you would have a separate file for each of these, but this is just for testing purposes, so that's fine. So if you look at the index file, there's a bit more here. Index file also imports React, which every React component must do. It imports this React DOM, and then it imports the style sheet, and it imports the app, which is the file we just looked at, this file here. See it, app.js. Import app from app.js, and it imports the service worker. The service worker, we're not going to need that. We could just remove it. We're just going to leave it for now. This is just something that it adds that people can use for more advanced things. We're not going to use it for this class. Then it has this React DOM.render. It renders React strict mode, which is just a way of saying that it will give you errors if you don't follow certain syntax. And then it renders this app. We could actually remove the strict mode. It will just make it easier to understand, I think. There we go. So it renders, it's a function, this React DOM render is a function that takes two arguments. It takes one argument, the first one, which is a React component. In this case, it's app. And it has this document get element ID root. So what this actually means is this is the thing that takes your React component or your React application and puts it into the context of the page. So if you look at the source code of this page, we just open it like this first. You can see this is the source code of this page here. And we can see here that there's this little div tag here that says ID equals root. We can also see that all this code I wrote, my name is Mass, is it visible on the site? It's not visible on the source code. It's only this ID root. So what it basically does is document get element by ID. You should remember that from one of the first lessons, JavaScript lessons. It will find this element, which has ID root, and it will inject the app component into it. So this is what it looks like on the page. If we use the inspector here, we can see it clearly. Oh, let's just get rid of this. You can see we have the ID root, then it injected the app component into it. The app component has class name app. You can see it here, class app, and then it has these names that I wrote out. My name is Mass, my name is John, etc., etc. So what the index file does, or more importantly, what this React DOM render does, is inject a component into an element in the DOM. Most likely, at least the React components of React projects I've worked on, you only have one of these. You don't typically render it multiple times. So you only have one app, which is like the core, like the root component, which contains everything else. And then everything else is built into that component as separate components, just like we do here. One app, which has this here, and then we can put as many components as we want into this. We could also put multiple components into this one if we wanted to. Let's just do an example of that just for fun. So if we wanted to render my name in here, that could also be done. So my name, let's just do name something and save that. Then this component could also re-render this. You can see it just renders it again. So that's the thing about reusing React components, reusing the code you wrote, so you don't need to write it 100 times in different places. You can write it once, have an isolated component, and use it however, wherever you want to use it. Let me just look at my little notes here. Hang on. Yes, okay. Let's talk a little bit more about props. Actually, yeah, let's just talk about props. You can see the props that I passed down. I pass it. Props, it's just a little note here. Props can only ever be passed down. You cannot pass props upwards. If you say I was in my name and I wanted to give a prop up to the app, like my name is rendered inside app, that is not going to be possible. Props are only pieces of data that can be passed down in the tree. And the tree meaning app is the root application, is the core the component that renders the full application. It has multiple components inside it. An app can pass components down to my name, for instance, or my second name, or anything else, and they can pass props down to the next level they have, and so on. But you can never pass it upwards in the tree. And if you try, you will fail. Like you will get errors. So you will see that. Let's try a different one. We're gonna have one more little example here, which is gonna be a bit more complex. Not too complex, but a bit more. I'm just gonna make a new file. We're gonna talk more about props and state. I'm gonna call this counter.js. Please note that React components are always in uppercase. If you write a component with a lowercase name, if I did this and try to render that, it would not work. Try it. See, it will not work. React only detects, you can see here, my name is using incorrect casing. React will only detect that it is a React component if it is an uppercase word. So it will fail instantly if you try it. So I call this counter. Let's just try here. Import React from React. I know it's a React component, so I always need to use this. You probably used, what's it called? For Node, you probably used module exports, something like this. Let's just write it out first. I'll just write it out. We'll go back to that. I'm going to use functional components because that is the best way, in my opinion, to do it. So this is just a basic component, and then I'm going to export this component. I'm just going to cover that. I'm just going to have return let's do button, and I'm going to do count. We're just going to cover these. I'm just going to show you an example of what it is. Okay, so we have a component. I import React. I created a little component here called counter. It has the props array, which I probably don't need actually. And I just returned some JSX, some HTML. It's just a button that says count inside it. And I use this export default counter. Export default is what I wanted to say before. Is probably the same. You probably use this in Node, module exports. This is how you write it in React code. Um, module export is not going to work in a browser. This is Babel. Well, this is probably going to work too, but this is how you write it. And Babel will transpile this or compile this into this when the browser reads it, or into something similar to this at least. So you use export default counter. There are other ways to export. We're just going to cover this for now. And when I want to import this, let's put it inside my app. I just use import counter from, and I use the path to the file that I just created. It's in the same folder, so I just use this and just say counter. And I'm going to put this down here. So let's see what happens there. So now we have a button called count. Doesn't do anything. I can assume this. There we go. Doesn't do anything. And I can add, let's just add a prop to this. Let's say count from 0. 0 is an interesting thing, actually. We're just going to cover that. So now I have a normal, I can say count from 0. This is a string though. I add these quotes around it. So this will automatically be a string in JavaScript. If you want to pass a number, we use the quotes or the brackets, sorry, and we pass it in like this. Now it's a variable. Now it's a JavaScript code. So now I can pass in a number. I don't have to pass in a string. So I will have my props, and I will use, there we go. I will use the curly brackets again because I want to put in a variable, and I will say I called it count from. Let's try to save that, and you will see this will change to 0. So I said count from 0, and I have this prop here. What I really want to do is I want to make a counter. I want to be able to click this, and then the number should increase. So I already told you before that it's not possible. Like I can say 5 here, right? And it will change to 5, which is fine. But how do I change it from inside this function here, or this component here? Because I get this from outside, and you cannot change properties ever. You always get them from somewhere outside. The counter has no idea where it comes from. It just receives a number, count from, which in this case is 5 right now. I'm just going to change it back to 0. And it just shows that. So it's not going to be able to do anything to it. So how do we actually solve that? Well, other than props, there's another one called state, which is it's not the opposite of it. I'm going to use state. There's state. State and props are different in the way that props are passed down from someone else. They just show up. This counter for this just has, I got this props object. I don't know where it came from, but it has this count from that I need, and that's all it cares about. It cannot change him. It cannot do anything to it. It just receives it from someone else. The state, on the other way, oh, sorry, I broke that one. The state, on the other hand, is something you can use inside the component. So if the component has to have dynamic data, something that is updated from inside the component itself that only itself needs to worry about, you can use state. You can use it for many different things. But I'm just going to do a very brief example of this. So, so use state. Oh, this is going to be a little complicated. Okay, use state. The syntax for use state is, I will not say, let's just call it my count. Set my count. I'm just going to cover this. I'm just going to write it out first. And we're going to use state, and we're going to do props count from. This looks a little weird. I could just write another one, say name, set name, and use state, just for an example, mass. Okay, so there are three parts of this component of use state. These are called hooks, and this is the first time a class has introduced this early. We're also going to use the class-based components, and I'm going to show you how to do it in class-based components. But for this example here, we're going to mainly focus on hooks because we want to use functional components because that is the future. But you're also going to learn a little bit about class-based components. So in functional components, using hooks, we have name. I'm just going to use this as an example. I'm going to remove it again a little bit. Set name, and we have this use state, which takes one parameter. This parameter here is what we call the initial state. So let me just do this. Whoop. It's going to output this name here so you can see what it is. See, it says mass here now. Mass, and it has the counter. So this name here, when you use state, what you give it as a parameter is the initial value it has. So when I give it mass, it will be mass. And this name here will contain what the state is. And the set name will allow you to update the state. So this is a variable that only exists inside the counter. Let's just comment this out. And the initial state is mass. So when I write it out, it's going to be mass, right? So let's say I update this. On click, this is an event handler. I will just make an arrow function, and I will use set name. Whoop, messed that up. There we go. Where are we? Here. Just write this like this so it's easy to read. So I give an on click, which is an event handler. You already saw these earlier when you used normal JavaScript. And I will set math name to Susan, for instance. So what happens when I click the button now? The initial state, the state of the variable name, is mass until it's changed. That's because I wrote it in as the variable here. So when I click the button, it calls this function that set the name, which is the second variable, which is a setter, which allows you to update the state to Susan. So when I click the button, Susan, right? So state is like dynamic variables you can use inside the app to update something. They will only exist inside where it's created. So this name and use state, all this only exists in here. I can pass it down as props if I want to, but it only exists in here. So the reason, let me just comment this out. I'm not going to need that. The reason I wrote the other one here, I have the same concept, my count and set my count. My count is the initial state, or is the current state that we have. Set my count allows me to update the state. and then I use useState props count from. So props is given from outside the function. It's given from the app here as 0. So when it loads the first time, it will take that 0 and put it into the initial state. This is the initial state. Initial state, right? That's put in there. So I put that 0 in there. So my count the first time, oh, running out of battery. There we go. So my count, so instead of writing the props in here, I'm going to use my state. I'm just going to do nothing here for now. Whoop. Oh, because I still have name here. Let's get rid of that. Okay. So it still says 0 because I put the props into the state. The initial state is now 0. So this my count, the first argument, is 0. And the setter, I don't use it yet. This is called destructuring, by the way, when you write it like this. This is basically an error. Well, I don't know if you remember destructuring. This is basically an arrow. So an array, sorry. So if I have an array that says 0 and then some function, this is an array with 2 elements. First is just an example, my count. The second is set my count. So when you write it like this, it's called destructuring. And you can have my first item, my second item, second item, array. So it will take these and put these. So this now will be 0. It'll put this variable here. And this variable here will be this function here. So it's the same thing that happens up here. That's why it's written like this. I'm not sure how much you've been using destructuring, but that's what it is. And this is what the syntax looks like always for useState. Okay, but I have the 0 here. So now I want to update it. So how do I update it? So I use the onClick event. When I click the button, I want this to happen. I know I have 2 variables here. I have my count and I have set my count. Set my count is the way I use to update the state. So when I click the button, I can set my count to 1. Right? When I click it, it's going to be 1. But I can't click it anymore because it's always going to set it to 1. So instead of setting it to 1, I can have set my count plus 1. So it will take the current state, which is my count, add 1 to it, and then use the setter to update the state. And then React will figure this out and re-render the component every time. So now I can click the button and it just keeps going, right? Okay. So what can we pass in as props? We can also pass in, I'm just going to make an example. It's not really related to the counter. I could pass in other things. My function, I could pass in functions like you saw before with onClick. This one that broke it. Something's broken with my syntax. There we go. Pass in functions. You can pass in objects. You can pass in arrays, strings, basically any data type from JavaScript you can pass in and you can use as you want. All right, let's just try before we finish this. Let's just make another counter. So counter class based. Let's call it that. .js. So we're going to do this exact same implementation as this, but we're going to use a class-based component instead of using a functional component. So this one uses useState. UseState is different when you use class-based component. Let's try it. So I have import React again. That's the same. And then I'm going to say, I'm just going to call it counter. Oh, I wanted to do a class. I never really use classes that much anymore. React component. Then we're going to do this. We're going to render. It's like I showed before. And we're going to render the same thing. I'm just going to take it from here. I'm going to render that. So same thing as before. And then we're going to export default counter. Whatever I call it inside this class doesn't matter as much. Normally we'll call it the same, but it's just such a long name. So I can import it here. I'll just say counter class. Let's just call it counter class just to make things easier. Just going to rename that counter class based. So what happens when I load this? It's obviously not going to work because I didn't implement, I removed like half the stuff I implemented. There we go. See, it will fail. It will say set my count is not defined. My count is not defined. That makes sense, right? Because I used these variables before and I don't have them inside this file. So, class-based components. If you want to have a state, just like I had in the other component, I used this. I'm just going to copy it over so we can see it. If I want to have a class-based component, I cannot use state because that is a hook and that only works with functional components, either as an arrow function or so you could also just write it as like function counter. That would be fine as well. Typically, you would use arrow function. So remove that. But I cannot use state in here. So I have to use what ClassBase have for their state, which is using the constructor. As you remember from the JavaScript class, hopefully, the constructor runs as soon as this class is instantiated. So when an instance this class is created, it will run this constructor. The constructor has the props argument. And when you use a constructor inside React, we're just going to show you actually. Let's just comment this out for now. So it will run. Let's do test. So it should run and it will write, oh, because I didn't. It will give you these errors. When you use the constructor, you might get these must call super constructor in derived class before accessing this or returning from derived constructor. So what does that mean? It means that we extend this React component and this React component also has a constructor. So in order to call that, make sure we don't overwrite it. We call it like this. And you always do this when you use class-based components. You always do this or it will fail. So now it will run. I have to return some HTML. There we go. So now it'll run. We'll just put this down here. So this is how the state works. Similar to what we use state. In class-based component, it's called this state. And you just basically just give it the initial state inside the constructor. So I will make a variable called my count, or sorry, a key inside this object. And I will use the same as I did before, count from. So now I set the state. When it initially loads, I set the state of my count to this count from prop that I got from the app. This is similar to what we did with functional components. It's just a different way of writing it. I strongly prefer functional components. Okay, so that's one part of the puzzle, right? Let's get rid of this. The second part, so when we want to have this here, we don't have the variable. We need to get it from the state. So we can say this state my count. Since we use it twice, I prefer to use destructuring. So we can do this, my count, this state, which is easier to read. They don't have these long variable names inside the markup, which is nice. Prefer this. If you don't, then, well, you can do whatever, but this is a better way of doing it. Just saying. So now it will render. You have 0. This one works, right? This is the one I built before with functional components. This one does not. So in order to have this way of updating, before we had this set my count, we were just giving by the React library. We have to make this ourselves now. So I'm going to make a new method on the class, set my count, and we're going to use this set state, which updates the state. And we're going to say my count. Let's just take this out again. Oh, my count. The state. Well, I'm not sure you know the syntax. If you just have a variable and you want it to be called the same name inside the object, you can just do this. You can do this. Or you can assign it specifically if you want. But since they're the same name, this and this is exactly the same. So I prefer this, but you can use either one. Now you've seen it. So set my account, and then we add the on-click event again on the button. And because this is a class, just like when you use classes, everything is referred to with this. This set my account. Let's just call it update count instead. Makes more sense. So update count, this is still going to give an error. We'll see that in a second. Everything renders. When I click this, nothing happens. And why does nothing happen? It's kind of a tricky one. Does it render this? Does it load? It does load. You can see it here inside the console. I'm just pointing with my hand. Let me just here. So it definitely renders this, but it doesn't update the state. And why is that? One tricky bit about class-based components, when you create your own methods like this, update count, and you use this inside it, it doesn't know what this is because it doesn't have the same scope. So it doesn't have the correct scope to be able to access this. So this is kind of a weird thing, but this is just what it is with class-based components. In order to handle this, you update this and you use bind. I'm not sure you have seen it. You might have. As you see, I use the name. I just say this update count equals to this update count bind this. So I bind the scope to this function. So now instead of not having access to this, and that's the same instance, it will now have access to the same variables that the other one does. Using this, it will access to the state. See if it works. Doesn't work. Great. Oh, because I obviously didn't plus one. There we go. So it was not the same, this one. Let's just see for fun if it would have worked if I hadn't done this. It would have. That is odd. Okay, but normally, just gonna go back a little bit on what I said. If you use functions like this inside a class and you call them like this, I would recommend using bind. Or if you see problems that you don't know what it is, it can't find this, it's because you didn't use bind. Or just use functional components, which is infinitely easier. Anyway, so I create a little bug, that's fine. And this one, see, they both work. So the trick is the difference between props and state and reusable components. Just add this up here. Is that the state is only inside the component. So if I create let's just create a bunch of them, instances of the counter, they will all count individually because they use their own state to determine what the current count is. They don't share this property. The only thing they share is the prop that we give them, which is now 0. It could be different, of course. And it will allow us to create reusable components that can be easily reused. If I had built a massive counter component and we need to use it 10 different places, it would just copy this part over and all of them could share the same implementation, which is the counter. Let's just see if we have anything left here. Okay, I think that's all. Just a bit of recap. The interesting parts here, of course, using components, why we use components in React, what components are. Typically, if you use functional components, they're just going to be functions that return JSX, which is very similar to HTML, but allows you to implement these variables. The second thing we need to understand is props, how to pass props, similar to attributes from HTML objects, but you can call them whatever you want. You can pass them in however you want. And you can use these to give data, pass down data to different components that they need. And then the last thing is state. Either use state if you use functions, which is the preferred approach, in my opinion, or if you want to use classes, you use this state inside the constructor, similar to this. That is all. Um, if anyone has any questions, we'll deal with it on Sunday, and I will hope you have a good weekend. Thank you.